Yogi Bear wasn't supposed to be the star. He was a 7-minute filler segment, stuck at the bottom of somebody else's cartoon, made by a studio that only existed because MGM had just fired everyone who made Tom and Jerry. 2 years later, he'd out-popularized the dog he was hired to support, dodged a lawsuit from a baseball legend, and turned cheap animation into a punchline nobody was laughing at anymore. This is the rise and fall of Yogi Bear. Like this, if you can still hear "smarter than the average bear." Subscribe for more retro deep dives. Yogi only got made because 2 men lost their jobs. William Hanna and Joseph Barbera had spent 17 years directing Tom and Jerry for MGM, winning 7 Oscars, but the math had stopped working. Theatrical shorts cost too much to produce and made no more money than just re-releasing the ones already in the vault. On May 15, 1957, MGM shut its animation division down entirely. Hanna and Barbera were unemployed for the first time since the 1930s. They had no backup plan, just an idea for a cat and dog TV show, and a studio that had just laid off its entire animation staff at once, meaning they could hire the whole department back the moment someone agreed to bankroll them. MGM passed. Columbia's Screen Gems didn't. Hanna Barbera Productions launched in July 1957, built from the wreckage of the studio that fired its own founders. Television paid nothing like features did, so the 2 men had to solve a problem Disney never touched. How do you make a cartoon that doesn't bankrupt you in 7 minutes? Their answer became the studio's whole identity: planned animation, a polite term for cutting corners on purpose. A theatrical MGM short ran through roughly 14,000 drawings. Hanna-Barbera got that down to around 2,000 for a comparable segment, holding bodies still, redrawing only a mouth or an eyebrow, recycling backgrounds, letting a character talk through a static profile instead of a full turn. It looked cheaper than Tom and Jerry because it was cheaper than Tom and Jerry, on purpose, down to the dollar. That's the reason Yogi exists at all. A character built almost entirely out of a held pose and a big voice was exactly what a $3,000 budget could afford. And Barbera made sure the studio had the voices to carry it. Daws Butler and Don Messick were hired in 1957, before Yogi existed, specifically because the animation itself would rarely be doing the heavy lifting. Neither man knew the insurance policy would end up being a bear. Hanna-Barbera's first real hit wasn't built around Yogi. It was built around a dog. The Huckleberry Hound Show premiered September 29, 1958, 3 7-minute segments stitched into 1/2 hour. Huckleberry Hound, then Pixie and Dixie and Mr. Jinx, then a segment nobody expected much from, a wisecracking bear and his nervous sidekick, debuting in Yogi Bear's Big Break. 2 things locked into place with him immediately. Daws Butler modeled Yogi's blustery, malaprop-prone voice almost note for note on Art Carney's Ed Norton from the Honeymooners, and the writers gave him a straight man on day 1. Boo-boo, cautious where Yogi was reckless. There specifically so, Yogi's schemes had someone to talk them past. Audiences didn't watch the way the schedule assumed. They watched all 3 segments and kept coming back for the bear. Within 2 years, the filler had eclipsed the character the show was named after. Yogi landed close enough to Yankees catcher Yogi Berra that Berra considered legal action once the character got his own series in 1961. Accounts disagree on how far it went. Some describe a formal defamation suit later withdrawn, others say it never made it past a lawyer's letter. What both versions agree on, the studio called the resemblance coincidence, and Berra later delivered his verdict with the deadpan he was famous for. Television, he said, was big enough for both of them, and he'd only considered suing until somebody reminded him Yogi wasn't even his real name. Whatever happened in that lawyer's office, the name survived it. And by the time the dispute surfaced, Yogi was already popular enough that renaming him would have cost the studio more than any settlement. If you like finding out your favorite cartoon character was one lawyer's letter away from a different name, that's this channel every week. Subscribe, because Yogi's jump from filler segment to Hanna-Barbera's biggest star happens next. By 1960, Yogi was profitable enough to reshape the studio around him. That January, the Huckleberry Hound Show became the first animated series to win an Emmy, Outstanding Achievement in Children's Programming. Proof the cheap, corner-cutting style critics had written off could still win the industry's own awards. A year later, Yogi did something no supporting cartoon character had done before. He left the show that made him famous and got his own. The Yogi Bear Show premiered January 30th, 1961, pulling Boo Boo and a new segment, Snagglepuss, along with it. The new show also finished building the world around him. Ranger Smith arrived as the authority figure worth outsmarting, and Cindy Bear gave Yogi a reason to show off. Then, in 1964, Yogi became the subject of Hey There, It's Yogi Bear, Hanna Barbera's first theatrical feature and the first ever full-length animated film built around a character who started on TV rather than in theaters. Disney had spent decades proving a cartoon could carry a feature. Yogi proved a 7-minute filler segment could too, 4 years after his debut episode. None of it happened because Yogi was designed to be a franchise. It happened because a bear built cheaply enough to survive a $3,000 budget turned out popular enough to justify real money. And once that math worked once, Hanna Barbera never stopped running it. Yogi's face went on lunchboxes, records, and toys through the 1960s. The same licensing playbook Hanna Barbera ran across its whole roster. In 1966, the studio was sold to Taft Broadcasting. A deal actually struck a year earlier but delayed months by an unrelated lawsuit from a former Columbia studio head's family. Hanna and Barbera stayed on as co-presidents, but the company built from 2 unemployed animators borrowing back their old MGM co-workers was now, within a decade, corporate property. Taft leaned into what it had bought. Real Jellystone Park branded campgrounds began opening under license. A bear invented to save money on ink had become valuable enough to license his fictional forest as a real one. By the early 1970s, Yogi wasn't just a cartoon character. He was a brand with a real estate footprint, and that kind of success came with an expiration date nobody at the studio seemed to notice arriving. Smarter than the Average Bear and Pick a Nick Basket had crossed over from a show people watched into a bit people just knew, the way a jingle outlives the commercial that introduced it. Popularity that big doesn't stay sharp forever, and Yogi's stopped being managed with any discipline almost as soon as the merchandise money started flowing. Yogi's gang arrived in 1973, dropping the bear and Boo Boo into a flying arc alongside a dozen other Hanna-Barbera characters to confront cartoon stand-ins for pollution, bigotry, and greed, a moral lesson format built more for the era's regulatory pressure on children's TV than for anything resembling Jellystone. Laff-A-Lympics followed in 1977, folding Yogi into a Saturday morning Olympics parody with dozens of other studio properties. Yogi's Space Race arrived in 1978, spinning off Galaxy Goof-Ups and putting the bear in a disco-lit spaceship uniform as an intergalactic ranger, about as far as the character could plausibly drift from a park bench and a stolen picnic basket. Yogi's treasure hunt sent him globe-trotting after lost artifacts in 1985, alongside a run of made-for-TV specials that kept him technically active almost every year of the decade without ever really returning him to Jellystone for long. By 1991, the drift had a name, Yo Yogi, aging Boo Boo and Cindy into teenagers solving mysteries, the exact reboot through de-aging move that only shows up once a studio has run out of other ideas for a character. Each version wasn't necessarily worse on its own, but stacked together across 2 decades, they spread one 7-minute idea about a bear stealing picnic baskets across arc crossovers, space operas, and a teen mystery show. And the more places Yogi turned up, the less any single appearance felt like the reason people loved him in 1959. The flexibility that kept him on air for decades is also what slowly stopped him being the sharp, Ed Norton-voiced troublemaker most people actually remembered. Yogi's fall wasn't really his own. It belonged to the studio that made him, and that studio's ownership kept changing hands long after Hanna and Barbera had built anything themselves. Taft, later Great American Broadcasting, held Hanna-Barbera through most of the character's overexposed years. In 1991, Turner Broadcasting bought the studio outright, absorbing its entire library, Yogi included, largely to fill the cable channels Ted Turner was building. Turner merged into Time Warner in 1996, and by 2001, Hanna-Barbera as an actual working studio had stopped existing, folded into Warner Brothers Animation as a legacy label attached to a back catalog. The company Hanna and Barbera built out of their own unemployment in 1957 had, within 4 decades, changed hands 3 times and dissolved into a line item on somebody else's org chart. The character kept resurfacing anyway, because a brand that valuable doesn't just disappear. In 2010, Warner Brothers released a live-action and CGI Yogi Bear feature with Dan Aykroyd voicing the title role, half a century removed from Daws Butler's original take. It made money. It also confirmed how far the character had traveled from a 7-minute filler segment shot on a shoestring budget in 1958. Yogi Bear was never supposed to be Hanna Barbera's biggest star. He was a cost-saving measure, built to hold still, redraw cheap, and fill 7 minutes at the bottom of somebody else's show, voiced as a knockoff of a sitcom sewer worker, almost renamed by a baseball player's lawyer before he'd even finished becoming famous. But he outgrew every limitation he was built around, carried a nearly bankrupt studio into an Emmy, a movie theater, and a real estate brand, and then got stretched so thin across arcs and space races and teen reboots that the same flexibility that made him valuable is what wore him down. That's not a tragedy. That's just what happens to a cartoon character who survives long enough to become a brand instead of a bit. Smarter than the average bear turned out to be true in ways nobody at that studio in 1958 could have planned for, and in ways they couldn't quite control either.